Good morning, friends. Since we've completed our series going through the Ten Commandments, I'd like to spend just a few minutes in Romans chapter 6 as a way to transition from a discussion of God's law to a greater investigation of His grace. But as we make that transition, it is important to once again remind ourselves that the law remains applicable to our lives today, even as we recognize that we do live according to grace. So let's read Romans chapter 6, verses 13 and 14 to find out how all this fits together. Paul writes, "Do not present your members," and by this he means all the parts of who we are, "do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace." And that last statement is where the confusion comes from. Paul says that we are not under law, but under grace. But that confusion is cleared up if we remember that this is not a solitary statement to be taken in a vacuum without its proper context. Because at the top of verse 13, Paul also said, "Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness." And the thing is that when people will say we aren't under the law, by which they mean we don't have to follow the rules of the law, they no longer apply. Yet how are we supposed to identify what is sinful, what it is that acts as instruments of unrighteousness, if we disregard the standard that God has put forward in His law? And perhaps that's the point, because this is actually a very subtle way where people can gain that idea of autonomy and self-rule that we've talked about before. Because if we can convince ourselves that God's law doesn't apply, and especially if we can convince ourselves that the Bible itself affirms that idea, then by default we can then set our own standards to live by, seemingly with the full approval of the Bible to boot. But the problem with that line of thinking is that in the immediate context of saying that we are not under law but under grace, Paul is also showing great concern that we not sin and instead be found righteous in God's presence. And if God is the one to whom we present ourselves, then it must continue to be His standard of right and wrong by which we are judged, which means His law remains in play. But with this understanding, how is it that he can then go on to say that we're not under law but under grace? Because if God's standard of right and wrong is still in play, then are we not still very much under His law? Well, we see the crucial difference when Paul says that we are to present ourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. You see, on the one hand, we have death. On the other, we have life. And on the one hand, we have the law, and on the other, we have grace. And death comes from the law, because for the law to produce life, we'd have to keep it perfectly, as sinless perfection is the required standard for us to earn heaven and eternal life according to our own abilities. But no one apart from Christ can do that. And so even though the law itself is good, and it reflects the goodness of God's holy character, by our inability to keep it, it produces death in us. And that death-producing consequence of the law is the part of the law that we are no longer under, because we have the grace of God through Jesus Christ, which leads to life. We have moved from death to life. The law remains good. It continues to reflect the purity of God's character, but we are no longer subject to the previously foregone conclusion and consequence of failing to keep it perfectly, because we trust in the one who did keep it perfectly and who took our sin upon Himself. And so we observe God's moral law as an act of obedience and worship to Him, but we trust in the grace of Jesus Christ for our actual salvation. And I am extremely excited to examine that grace in ever greater detail in the days to come. Until then, have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I'll see you tomorrow.